Alyssa Bustamante. On a cool October evening in 2009, a teenage girl in the small community of St. Martin's, Missouri, got dressed and went to a church dance. By every account, she seemed ordinary that night, laughing with the people around her, giving no outward sign that anything was wrong. Only hours earlier, she had taken the life of a child who lived a short walk from her own front door. And what police would later find written in her own hand turned this into one of the most studied juvenile cases the state had ever seen. Years before any of that, Alyssa Bustamante was a 15-year-old living with her grandparents after a childhood marked by instability. She had struggled for a long time with depression, had been prescribed medication, and carried a documented history of self-harm. To neighbors, she was a quiet teenager in a quiet town. To the people closest to her, she carried something darker that none of them fully understood. On October 21st, 2009, a young girl from the same neighborhood went missing. She had been walking a familiar route when she disappeared, and within hours her family raised the alarm. The community organized searches, volunteers combing the wooded areas near their homes. For 2 days, no one knew what had become of her. What investigators eventually learned was that Bustamante had lured the child away under a false pretense, leading her into the woods, where she took her life. Prosecutors would later argue that the act had been planned well in advance, rather than committed in a moment of panic. When detectives finally questioned Bustamante, she led them to where the child had been left, ending the search and beginning a case that would haunt everyone connected to it. Among the evidence was Bustamante's personal journal. In it, she had written about what she had done on the very same night, in language so detached that it disturbed even seasoned investigators, before noting that she then had to leave for the church event. You'd think someone close to her would have noticed something was wrong. Nobody did. Bustamante was initially charged with first-degree murder and armed criminal action, and she was certified to stand trial as an adult. In January of 2012, she pleaded guilty to the reduced charge of second-degree murder, along with armed criminal action. The following month, in a Cole County courtroom, the focus turned to sentencing. Mental health experts testified that she suffered from major depressive disorder and borderline personality disorder, and her defense argued that a heavy dose of prescribed medication may have acted as a catalyst. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with the possibility of parole for the killing itself, and an additional 30 years to be served consecutively for the weapons charge. For years, that appeared to settle the matter. Then Missouri changed its laws. A statute passed in 2021 made some juvenile offenders eligible for a parole hearing after 15 years. Because it excluded first-degree murder, but not second-degree, Bustamante qualified, and in July of 2024, she appeared before the parole board by video. She was denied. The hearing reopened old wounds for the victim's family, who described it afterward as another day of grieving, and said that details of the crime never allowed at trial were finally spoken aloud. In response, Missouri lawmakers moved quickly. The governor signed a new measure, Senate Bill 754, closing the loophole for juveniles convicted of first or second-degree murder. Prosecutors said they hoped the change would push any future hearing well past the end of the decade, with the next one currently set for 2029. The girl who once slipped away to a church dance as if nothing had happened now remains incarcerated at the Chillicothe Correctional Center. Even if she were one day granted parole on the life term, she would still owe the consecutive 30 years, placing any realistic release decades away. Somewhere near the year 2059, Bustamante's victim lived only a short walk from her home. In the next case, the distance between the person responsible and the person who was harmed was smaller still. It was the width of a single room, inside a house where everyone was supposed to be safe. Claire Elise Miller. At 13 minutes past 4 in the morning, in a quiet township outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, police pulled up to a suburban home and found a teenage girl standing outside in the cold. She had blood on her clothing and had been trying to wash her hands in the snow. Moments earlier, she had dialed emergency services herself and confessed to what she had done. Inside the house, her older sister was already gone. The date was February 22nd, 2021. Claire Miller was 14 years old, and the sister she had harmed fatally, Helen, was 19. Helen lived with cerebral palsy. She was nonverbal, used a wheelchair, and depended entirely on the people around her. The two sisters shared a home with their parents, who were asleep when it happened. When officers entered, they found Helen beyond saving and a knife nearby. Claire was taken into custody at the scene, still repeating that she had harmed her sister. There was no mystery about what had occurred or who was responsible. The hard questions in this case would never be about guilt. They would be about why. In the days that followed, a far more complicated picture emerged. Claire's defense team argued that she had suffered a psychotic break, that she had been hearing commanding voices she could not silence, and that she had not been in control of her actions. They asked the court to move her case into the juvenile system, where the focus would be treatment rather than punishment. Because Pennsylvania treats a homicide charge as an adult matter from the outset, Claire had been charged as an adult automatically. In July of 2022, after reviewing the evidence, the judge denied the request to send the case to juvenile court. Claire would be tried as an adult. Rather than go to trial, she entered a plea. In March of 2023, by then 16 years old, she pleaded guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder. The plea acknowledged both that she had taken her sister's life and that she had been living with serious mental illness when she did. The court determined she was mentally ill, though not mentally disabled in the legal sense that would have changed her responsibility. The district attorney was careful to draw that line in public. The office did not dispute that Claire had been in the grip of a genuine mental health crisis. But under the law, that crisis explained her actions without excusing them. She was sentenced to 12.5 to 40 years in state prison. Helen had been the older of the two, the sister who needed constant care. In the coverage that followed, those who knew the family kept circling the same painful question. How does a household built around protecting its most vulnerable member end with that member gone and another child responsible? There were no satisfying answers. Before the crime, Claire had built a sizable following on social media. And after her arrest, strangers online dissected her old videos looking for warning signs. People wanted there to have been a clear signal that someone missed. The reality was murkier than the version the internet preferred to tell. Today, Claire Miller is serving her sentence at a state correctional facility for women in Pennsylvania. Under the terms of that sentence, she will not be eligible for release until she has served at least 12.5 years, which means the earliest she could be considered falls near the middle of the next decade. Claire Miller's case turned on a mind that, by the court's own finding, had lost its grip on reality. The next case raised the exact opposite question. What happens when a court looks at a young defendant and concludes, without doubt, that she knew precisely what she was doing? Mackenzie Sharilla. Just before 5:30 on a summer morning in Strongsville, Ohio, a car moving at extreme speed left the roadway and slammed into a brick building. The impact was so violent that first responders assumed they were looking at a terrible accident. Two young men inside the car did not survive. the 17-year-old behind the wheel did. And the more investigators learned about the days leading up to that morning, the less it looked like an accident at all. It was July 31st, 2022. Mackenzie Sherilla was driving her own car. In the passenger seats were her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, who was 20, and his friend Davion Flanagan, who was 19. Both men lost their lives at the scene. Sherilla was seriously injured, but survived. In the immediate aftermath, there was little reason to suspect anything beyond reckless driving by a teenager. But as detectives pulled data from the car and from Sherilla's phone, a very different story took shape. Location records showed she had driven to the exact area of the crash 3 days earlier. Friends told investigators that during arguments, she had threatened to crash the car, and one recalled hearing her say, roughly 2 weeks before, that she would wreck it right then and there. In November of 2022, Sherilla was arrested and charged with 17 counts, including 2 counts of aggravated murder. The case prosecutors built was not about a single moment of teenage carelessness. It was about intent, and they argued that the version most people had assumed was not the full picture. Sherilla made an unusual choice. Rather than place her fate with a jury, she chose a bench trial, leaving the verdict to a single judge. In August of 2023, that judge delivered her decision, finding Sherilla guilty on charges including murder, felonious assault, and aggravated vehicular homicide. Her remarks from the bench drew national attention. She said this had not been reckless driving at all, but a deliberate act, that Sherilla had set out with a mission and carried it through with precision, and that the mission had been death. A week later, Sherilla was sentenced to a combined term of 15 years to life, made up of 2 concurrent life sentences with parole eligibility after 15 years. That places her first realistic chance at release somewhere around October of 2037. Her legal team fought the verdict at every turn, and the appeals are where this case lingered. An initial appeal in 2023 was denied. An Ohio appeals court largely upheld the convictions the following year. A second appeal, filed in the spring of 2025, was rejected as untimely, having been submitted a single day past the deadline. That's not a typo. One day, in early 2026, the appeals court upheld that denial, and the Ohio Supreme Court declined to take up the matter. The case drew renewed public attention in 2025 when a documentary about it was released by a major streaming service. Through all of it, Sherilla's parents have maintained that she is innocent, and her father has continued to state publicly that she was falsely accused. Today, Mackenzie Sherilla is housed at the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville. Barring a successful future appeal, she will remain there until at least the late 2030s before she can even be considered for parole. A judge looked at Mackenzie Sherilla and saw a person who understood exactly what she intended to do. The following case sits at the far opposite end of that spectrum, where the central question was whether 2 children could even tell the difference between the real world and a story they had found on the internet. Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier. It began with a sleepover between 3 12-year-old friends and a character that does not exist. By the end of that morning, one of those girls had been left in the woods after an attack she would barely survive, and the 2 responsible believed they had done it to protect their families from a monster they had read about online. It remains one of the most unsettling juvenile cases in American history. The character was Slender Man, a tall, faceless figure invented for an internet horror forum and spread through user-written stories. To most readers, he was fiction, a campfire tale for the digital age. But to Morgan Geyser and Anissa Weier, both 12 years old and living in Waukesha, Wisconsin, he had become real. They came to believe that to prove their loyalty to him, they had to take a life. On May 31st, 2014, after the sleepover, the two girls led their friend and classmate into a wooded area of a local park. There, Geyser attacked her, while Vire urged her on. They left her there, believing she would not be found. What they did not account for was her will to live. The girl pulled herself out of the trees and onto a path, where a passing cyclist found her and called for help. Doctors later said she had come dangerously close to not surviving. She lived. The two girls were located soon after, and they spoke openly to investigators about why they had done it. Their belief in Slender Man was not a cover story. It was, as far as anyone could tell, completely sincere, and that sincerity would sit at the center of everything that followed. Both were charged as adults, a decision that drew national debate given their age. Over the next few years, the cases moved toward a resolution that recognized their mental state. In 2017, Vire pleaded to being a party to attempted second-degree intentional homicide. Geyser pleaded to first-degree attempted intentional homicide. Both were found not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, which meant that instead of prison, they were committed to a state mental health institution. Vire received a commitment of up to 25 years, and Geyser up to 40. These were not prison sentences, but civil commitments, so each could petition for release as her condition improved. Vire was granted conditional release in 2021. After several denied petitions, Geyser was granted conditional release in 2025, placed in a group home under monitoring and supervision designed to last until 2058. The plan was meant to hold for decades. It would not last months. On the night of November 22, 2025, Geyser, by then 23, cut off her monitoring bracelet and left, traveling roughly 165 miles by bus to a town in Illinois in the company of a 43-year-old man. She was found the next day outside a truck stop. When officers approached, she first gave a false name, then told them she did not want to identify herself because she had done something very bad, and suggested they simply search her name online. And no, that is not a dramatization of the exchange. She was returned to Wisconsin, and on December 23, 2025, a judge revoked her conditional release, sending her back to the Winnebago Mental Health Institute. As of now, Geyser is back in state custody, while Vire remains on conditional release in the community. The case that started with a piece of internet fiction is, more than a decade later, still working its way through the courts. This story isn't over, not even close. Geyser and Vire were driven by something they believed was real, however impossible it sounds. The final case in this group came down to a motive far more familiar, and in its cold ordinariness, just as chilling. It came down to money. Amber Bray. From the outside, the family looked like a quiet success story. A teenage honors student and cheerleader, a mother who had built a career as an executive at a major record label, and a comfortable home in Burbank, California. But in the early hours of a January morning in 1996, that picture shattered, and the person at the center of it was the family's own daughter. Amber Bray was 18 years old. By the accounts of those who knew her, she was bright and accomplished, the kind of student teachers expected good things from. What few people saw was a relationship with an older boyfriend named Jeffrey Glenn Ayers, and a growing resentment toward her mother, Dixie Lee Hollier. On January 16, 1996, around 5 in the morning, Hollier was attacked in the family home and did not survive. At first, the brutality of the scene suggested an intruder. But as investigators looked more closely at the people around Dixie Hollier, suspicion began to turn toward her own daughter. Prosecutors came to believe the crime had been planned and that the motive was money. Hollier's death stood to leave Amber an inheritance of roughly $310,000. Investigators alleged that Amber and Ayers had plotted the act together and that the plan had not stopped with her mother. According to prosecutors, Amber had also discussed taking the life of her younger sister. As the case was built, letters between Amber and Ayers became central to it. The correspondence, including one note the couple had given a title of its own, helped prosecutors argue that this had been a deliberate, premeditated plan rather than a sudden act. The defense, for its part, pointed to alleged abuse in the home as context for what had happened. If the jury had accepted that framing, this might have become a very different story. It did not. A jury convicted Amber Bray of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Crucially, the jury also found special circumstances true, that the crime had involved lying in wait and that it had been committed for financial gain. Under California law, those findings carried enormous weight. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with thousands of dollars in fines and restitution. Ayers was tried separately, convicted, and also received a life term. Because Amber was 18 at the time of the crime, she had been an adult in the eyes of the law from the very beginning, with none of the juvenile protections that shaped some of the other cases. In the decades since, Amber Bray has remained at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla. Behind those walls, her life has taken an unexpected turn. She earned a paralegal credential and has worked as an advocate on sentencing issues for other incarcerated women, drawing on the very legal system that put her there. California has, in recent years, passed a series of reforms aimed at people who committed crimes when they were young. And questions have been raised about whether any of those changes could someday touch a sentence like hers. What is documented is this. As of the most recent available records, Amber Bray remains incarcerated at Chowchilla, serving the sentence handed down to her in the 1990s. If you like this video and haven't subscribed yet, now's a great time to join. We post a new case every day, so hit subscribe and don't miss what's coming next. Christine Paolilla. For 3 years, the deaths of 4 young friends inside a Houston home went unsolved. Investigators had a devastating crime scene, 4 lives taken in a single afternoon, and not one person they could charge. When the break finally came, it did not arrive through forensic science or a witness who had seen something that day. It came from a confession made years later to the last person anyone would have guessed. On July 18, 2003, in the Clear Lake area of Houston, Texas, 4 young people lost their lives inside a home that belonged to one of them. Their names were Rachel Colarutis, Tiffany Rowell, Marcus Priscilla, and Adelbert Sanchez. They were friends, gathered on an ordinary summer afternoon in a place that should have been completely safe. All 4 were shot, and the scene officers walked into was among the most harrowing the area had seen in years. The person responsible was 17-year-old Christine Paolilla, who had carried out the attack alongside her boyfriend, Christopher Snyder. For years, Paolilla had been bullied over a condition that caused her to lose her hair, and 2 of the victims had once gone out of their way to befriend her when few others would. That kindness, set against what she did, only makes the case harder to take in. The 4 of them had been close, ordinary young people with the rest of their lives ahead of them. 2 of the victims had been dating. Their families had expected to spend that summer worrying about colleges and jobs and curfews, not standing over 4 caskets. The loss tore through the community, and it left investigators under enormous pressure to find whoever had done this. In the weeks after, detectives had almost nothing to work with. There were no obvious suspects, no clear motive, and no one talking. They canvassed the neighborhood, chased every tip that came in, and offered a reward. But the leads thinned out and then dried up completely. The case drifted into the cold files, where it sat for years while the families waited for answers that never seemed to come. Then, slowly, the truth began to surface from inside Paulila's own life. She and Snyder had fallen into heavy drug use in the years that followed. And during that period, she told the man she had married, Justin Rott, what she had done. Around the same time, an anonymous tip to Crime Stoppers pointed investigators in her direction. She was arrested in San Antonio on July 19, 2006. That was 3 years and 1 day after the killings. To put it simply, the case broke almost exactly on its own grim anniversary. By then, her accomplice was beyond the reach of any courtroom. Snyder had died before police could take him into custody, which left Paulila to answer for all of it alone. On October 13, 2008, a Harris County jury convicted Christine Paulila of capital murder. At trial, prosecutors had laid out for the jury how the attack unfolded and how Paulila's own admissions, made long after the fact, had finally broken the case open. Because she had been a juvenile at the time of the crime, the law did not permit the most severe penalty available in Texas. So she received an automatic life sentence instead. Her legal team appealed, arguing that imposing a mandatory life term on someone so young was unconstitutional. In a substitute opinion handed down in May of 2011, a Texas appeals court rejected that argument and upheld her conviction. The challenges that followed were turned away as well. According to the records of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, Christine Paulila is serving her sentence at the Christina Melton Crane Unit in Gatesville. Under its terms, she must serve 40 years before she can even be considered for parole, a date currently set for July 22, 2046, when she would be around 60 years old. As of late 2025, she remains incarcerated there. Paulila turned on people who had once shown her kindness. In the case that follows, the betrayal ran straight through the walls of a family home, where the threat was never a stranger at the door, but someone already inside it. Aaron Caffey, a father woke in the dark to violence inside his own home, was gravely wounded and still found the strength to escape a house that was being set on fire around him. Bleeding, he crawled to a neighbor's door and named the person he believed was behind the attack. When investigators followed that name, the trail led them somewhere almost impossible to accept. It led back through his own front door to his teenage daughter. The attack happened in the early hours of March 1st, 2008, in the small communities of Alba and Emory in Rains County, Texas. 16-year-old Aaron Caffey had organized it, working with her boyfriend Charlie Wilkinson and his friend Charles Wade. A fourth person, Wade's girlfriend Bobby Gale Johnson, drove the car. While Aaron and Johnson waited outside, the two young men went into the home at around 3 in the morning. By the time it was over, Aaron's mother and her 2 younger brothers had lost their lives, and the family house had been set ablaze. The one person who was meant to die and did not was Aaron's father, Terry Caffey. He was shot several times, but he survived, pulling himself out of the burning house and across to a neighbor's home, where he was able to tell police who had attacked him. His account pointed directly at Wilkinson, and from there, the full shape of the plot came apart. The motive, when it emerged, was painfully small against the scale of what had happened. Erin's parents had tried to end her relationship with Wilkinson, and the entire plan had grown out of that single point of conflict. All 4 people involved were charged with 3 counts of capital murder, and the cases against them moved through the Rains County courts over the following year. The outcomes varied with each person's role. Wilkinson and Wade, the 2 who had gone inside the home, were each sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Bobby Gale Johnson, who had stayed in the car as the driver, received 40 years, with the chance of parole after 20. On January 2nd, 2009, Erin accepted a plea deal of her own. She received 2 life sentences and an additional 25 years to be served consecutively. Under that arrangement, she would not become eligible for parole until she was around 59 years old, with the Texas Department of Criminal Justice listing her parole eligibility date as March 1st, 2038. She is held at the Hobby Unit. What sets this case apart came from the survivor himself. Prosecutors had initially intended to seek the death penalty for the 2 men who entered the home. It was Terry Caffey, the father who had lost nearly his entire family, who asked them to take that option off the table. In the years since, he has spoken openly about forgiving his daughter, has devoted himself to full-time ministry, and has written a memoir about surviving that night, titled Terror by Night. Erin, for her part, has continued to insist that she did not mastermind the plan. She maintains that she was forced to wait in the car and did not understand what was about to happen inside. The courts did not accept that account, and her plea and sentence stand. As things stand today, she remains at the Hobby Unit, with that parole date in 2038 still well over a decade away. Erin Caffey's plot was set in motion by a relationship her parents tried to forbid. The next case also turned on a tangled relationship. But the thing that finally tipped it into deadly action was not love at all. It was a payout written into an insurance policy. Catherine Bellflower. A young woman in California was lured to her death over a life insurance policy and a relationship that had soured into something lethal. The plan was careful enough that it might have stayed buried for good. What undid it was a second person the conspirators had marked for death who survived and who walked into the hands of the police with the whole story. The case took shape in October of 2002 in the area between Livermore and Stockton, California. The victim was a teenage girl who had been legally emancipated and had married young. Her husband was a man named Michael Simons. The trouble began because Catherine Bellflower, often called Katie, was also involved with Simons, and around that overlap, a plot formed. Bellflower, Simons, and a third person, Jeffrey Hamilton, agreed to take the young woman's life. The motive was twofold. There was a life insurance policy worth $50,000, and there was the romantic entanglement that left the victim standing in the way of what the others wanted. It was a cold arithmetic, one that valued a young person's life at the figure printed on a policy. She was lured away, attacked, and her life was taken. Her body was later found near water. For a time, it was not clear who had been responsible or why, and the people who had planned it went on with their lives as though nothing had happened. The case might never have been solved at all, except that the conspirators had set their sights on more than one person. There was a second young woman they had targeted, and unlike the first, she survived. When she realized what had nearly happened to her, she went to the police and laid out the plot in detail. That account opened the door. Hamilton was arrested in March of 2003, and once in custody, he implicated the others, filling in the parts the surviving witness could not. Together, those two accounts pointed squarely at Bellflower and Simons as the planners. The scheme, in the end, was undone by the one person it failed to silence. And no, that is not a detail invented for dramatic effect. It is what the record shows. From there, the prosecutions moved forward. Michael Simons was convicted and sentenced to life, without the possibility of parole, with an additional 25 years attached. Catherine Bellflower entered a plea of no contest to murder around 2005 and was sentenced to 25 years to life. Jeffrey Hamilton was convicted of second-degree murder and received 15 years to life. Bellflower is incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility in Chowchilla, the same institution that has held several women in cases like these. Her specific current parole status is not clearly documented in the public record. What can be said with confidence is that, as of the most recent available information, she remains in custody there, serving a sentence that keeps any possibility of release years out of reach. Bellflower's case was driven by a payout and a relationship gone wrong, and it played out in the early 2000s. The next reaches back further still, to 1994, and to a 14-year-old whose sentence would eventually make legal history. What no one could have predicted was how her story would end. Christina Fetters. In 1995, a 15-year-old girl became the youngest female ever sentenced to life without parole in the state of Iowa. Nearly 2 decades later, that same person would become the first juvenile lifer in Iowa's history to be released. Both of those things are true, and the path between them runs from a violent night in a relative's home to a quiet bed in a hospice. Christina Fetters was born on February 5, 1980. Her early years were marked by deep instability. As a child, she endured abandonment and serious abuse, the kind of sustained harm that would later sit at the center of how courts understood her. By her early teens, she'd been placed at Orchard Place, a behavioral facility in Des Moines. On October 25, 1994, at 14 years old, Fetters left that facility without permission, along with another resident. She made her way to the home of her great-aunt, 73-year-old Arlene Claim. During what began as a robbery attempt, she attacked Claim, who did not survive. Fetters was arrested that same night and confessed. She was convicted of first-degree murder. On December 18, 1995, at the age of 15, she was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, becoming the youngest female in Iowa ever to receive that sentence. At the time, that was the end of the legal road. A child would grow old and die in prison, and the law saw no reason to revisit it. Years later, that certainty fell apart. In 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the case of Miller v. Alabama that mandatory life without parole sentences for juveniles were unconstitutional. The decision did not throw open any prison doors on its own. What it required was that courts go back and look again at each case individually, weighing the youth and circumstances of the person who had been sentenced. That ruling reached across the country and touched Fetters' case directly. Iowa began working through its juvenile lifers one by one, and Fetters was first in line. In November of 2013, she became the first inmate in the state to be resentenced under the new standard, and her sentence was changed to life with the possibility of parole. The documented harm she had suffered as a child, once a footnote, now sat at the heart of how the court understood her. By then, a different clock was running. Fetters had been diagnosed with inoperable stage 4 breast cancer. With her condition terminal, the Iowa Board of Parole granted her a compassionate end-of-life release in December of 2013, and she was moved to a hospice in Des Moines. In doing so, she became the first juvenile lifer in the state ever to walk out of prison. She did not have long. Christina Fetters died at that hospice on July 27, 2014, at the age of 34. It is a strange and difficult ending. The legal system that had once decided she should never leave prison was the same system that, in her final months, allowed her to die outside its walls. Looking back, it is hard not to see a person who began as a deeply harmed child and ended as a dying woman, with a long stretch of incarceration in between that the law itself eventually decided had been imposed the wrong way. Fetters' story closed with a measure of mercy, granted only because she was dying. The final case turns on a very different kind of surprise. It centers on a young woman whose role in a killing stayed completely hidden until she was the one who chose to bring it into the light. Tony Fratto. When a teenage girl vanished from a small Nevada town in the spring of 2011, suspicion settled quickly on one person. The other person involved was never even questioned. For months, Tony Fratto stood among the grieving classmates, took part in the search for answers, and said nothing about what she knew. The truth only came out when she finally decided to tell it herself. The community was West Wendover, Nevada, a small town pressed up against the state line. On March 3, 2011, 17-year-old Fratto and her boyfriend, a fellow student named Cody Cree Patton, took the life of a classmate, a teenage girl they both knew. They drove her to a remote stretch of desert near the border between Utah and Nevada. Her body was later found there, roughly 5 miles from the Utah line. In the immediate aftermath, investigators focused on Patton. He had been the obvious suspect from the start, and his case drew heavy attention in a town small enough that almost everyone knew almost everyone. Fratto, by contrast, was not on the radar at all. She moved through those weeks as just another shaken classmate, and there was little to suggest she had been anywhere near what happened. That changed when she came forward on her own, speaking not to the police, but to Patton's defense attorneys and admitting her part in the attack. That route was unusual, and it reshaped the case overnight. Without that admission, it is entirely possible her involvement would never have surfaced at all. In January of 2012, Fratto pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, with an added enhancement for the use of a deadly weapon. The plea allowed her to avoid the possibility of a death sentence. On April 16, 2012, White Pine District Judge Dan Papez sentenced her to life with the possibility of parole, followed by a consecutive term for the weapon enhancement. In practical terms, that meant a minimum of 18 years before she could be released, 10 years on the underlying charge, and another 8 on the enhancement. Patton, who was prosecuted separately, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, the harsher outcome of the two. For Fratto, the question of release has remained open for years. Her first bid for parole was denied in February of 2021. Records from the Nevada Board of Parole show that a second hearing was scheduled for February 15, 2024, at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center. The outcome of that hearing has not been clearly confirmed in the public record, which leaves a genuine gap in the story as it stands now. What is certain is where she is. As of the most recent available information, Tony Fratto remains incarcerated at the Florence McClure Women's Correctional Center. Whether she has been granted any movement toward release or denied it again is not something that can be stated with confidence today. In that sense, hers is the one case in this set that is still actively unfolding, with the decision resting now in the hands of a parole board rather than a courtroom. 10 young women, 10 different roads, and the same destination at the end of each one. A sentence handed down while they were still teenagers. Some of them will almost certainly grow old and die behind bars. Others may one day be released. And the question of who, if anyone, should walk free is still being weighed by the courts and the families left behind. Thanks for watching. Click here for the next video.